My name is Mark Rinker. When I was 7 years old, my father pulled out his stolen cassette recorder and taped my grandmother singing an old folk ballad she once used as a lullaby with him. After he hung himself, the tape came into my possession, and 5 hours ago, at about 9:15, I pulled it out of the basement for the first time in 20 years and listened to it, the sounds scratching and stuttering through the air as I sat in the backyard, the recorder propped up on 2 cinder blocks. My grandmother, who had never once been outside the country or even west of Ohio, sang in her croaky voice about a Scottish soldier gone far away until the weary tape jammed. I was crying. I took the tape out and I threw it into the trash can by the back step. It was 9:58, and Kirk would arrive in 2 minutes. As many bad things as there were about him, he was never late. I sat on the sofa in the living room and waited. I heard the porch door open at 10:01, and he came in without knocking, having parked his awful station wagon a mile away, as we'd agreed. He groused about almost getting killed by a passing car on Halt Horse Road, and griped about me living out in the middle of nowhere. He collapsed in a chair, sweating and drinking from a bottle of Sprite. He'd gotten a fractured skull in a hockey fight back when he played for the Wheeling Nailers, and long after they'd shaved his head to open him up, he'd kept the look because he thought it made him seem tougher. He had a delayed reaction to the fact that none of the lights were on. And then he mocked me for that too, said I was being overcautious. But I didn't want anyone looking at the house that night. He informed me that my grandmother was dead, right on the prearranged schedule. I had him say it again for confirmation. She was dead. He followed me into the kitchen, where I had $8,000 in cash stuffed inside a Ritz cracker box. Only after he crammed it all into the smallest pouch of his backpack did he tell me that not everything had gone exactly according to plan. Kirk had that way about him, a way of filling in the regrettable details only after he'd gotten what he wanted from you. He'd woken up the day before and he'd immediately seen an omen, a bad omen, he said. A group of deer congregating in a perfect circle beneath his window in the courtyard of his apartment complex in Shepherdstown. That was all it took, seeing them standing there in the rain. He'd called up some guy he knew, Amos, and cut him in on the deal if Amos would actually be the one to go in and take care of my grandmother instead of doing it himself, as we'd agreed. Amos, Kirk said, was the kind of person who could be counted on to solve a problem. The problem had been my grandmother had fought back. Hard. It didn't seem possible to me. She was 82 years old, spine crooked, hands gnarled, but Kirk swore it was true. He'd never seen anything quite like it. It had gotten messy. Amos had been forced to step up. There had been a lot of blood, but it had all been taken care of. No worries. When Kirk told me all this, I wanted to reach out and squeeze his neck until his head burst, but I knew he would destroy me if I so much as raised a finger to him. There was no need to do anything different at this point, he said. No need to vector off, as he put it, and panic or improvise. It was all done. There were no witnesses, and our business was complete. To emphasize the point, he licked 2 of his fingertips and playfully reached forward to snuff out the candle I held between them. Kirk was terrible. Kirk was awful. But at least, I think I have said, he was never late. He turned to go. At the door, he turned back and told me to go for a walk and clear my head. If I didn't stop being so scared, he said, he might not be able to trust me so much, and we might have to have another conversation sometime. I got the mahjong set from the hall closet and laid it out on the card table until about 11. What I do is set up 2 sides and play against myself. It's because I like the little symbols in the pieces. They're so pretty. And I like the way the tiles clack against each other. It relaxes me. I like the routine of getting up after a turn, walking around to the other side of the table, and sitting down there, looking in the other direction. It makes me feel like 2 different people. It's even nicer in the candlelight. Sometimes I pretend I'm playing against my father and trying to beat him with all my might, and if I manage to do it, I laugh at him with bottomless scorn, and I sleep well that night. Suddenly, right at the top of the hour, there was a knock at the front door. It jolted me so badly I almost knocked the candle over. I waited. No way was I going to answer that door. But then I saw a face appear at the living room window, peering in, one I recognized. I knew I had to get up. It was Ben Reedy. We used to call him Beady. He used to wear the thickest glasses you ever saw. He still wore them, but now they'd gotten sleek and stylish because he made a lot of money, or so I heard. I opened the door. The crickets across the road were really getting loud. I hadn't seen Beatty in almost 10 years. I was so nervous that I set the candle down so he wouldn't see my hands shaking. He was dressed nicely, like he'd come from work. He hadn't been able to get an answer when he'd knocked at my grandmother's house an hour before. So we thought maybe she'd be here at this place that had been willed to me. Her old Buick sat in the drive, dirty and unmaintained. I had an answer fully memorized. I said I hadn't seen her for about a week. The car had been sitting there for months. But Beatty wouldn't just turn and go away. He kept asking me questions and finally wanted to come in. I knew I had to let him do it. Beatty was smart. He had a master's degree in something or other. Beatty was capable of suspecting things. He didn't ask me about the darkness because he knew I was a nervous person and he had a little more class than someone like Kirk. I offered him water or a soda, but he refused. He wasn't worried about my grandmother if I wasn't, but he was headed out of town that night, and he thought it felt right to say so long to her. Back in the day, he used to visit her all the time, every couple of months or so. She'd shown kindness to him when he was a messed-up kid. Maybe she was even the reason he'd gone to college. I don't know. I tried not to ask too many questions. I wanted to keep things short, but I had to be polite and ask where he was headed, and he said he honestly did not even know. He kept grinning at me like he was goading me to ask him more. His intelligence had made him conceited. He tripped a little over the cat box on his way to the kitchen, where he had not asked permission to go. I didn't feel comfortable talking to him in there. The space was too tight. Now he wanted to know what I'd been doing for the last few years, why I hadn't been working, what I did all day in this house that was too big for me, where the county didn't even plow because the road was so long and narrow. Why didn't I just sell it? Why did I stay here where there were no jobs, where everyone we'd ever known had left long ago? It felt like an interrogation. I pushed the back door open and I went out and stood in the yard. He followed. I liked it better when Beatty was just a silhouette out there near the decaying bird bath, and I didn't have to carry the candle around. Beatty looked up at the moon. He was never going to see this town again, he said. He told me he'd been doing some work for some people down on Sargo Road for a long time. People whose names he wasn't even allowed to know. Russians. A kind of contract job, he said, month after month in the crappy little building where McGradnick and Brothers used to make pool tables. A long time ago, we would ride our bikes like little hellions down the twisty trail that started behind the lot. Beatty wanted to know if I'd ever wondered why an 8-foot fence had gone up around that building 6 years ago, or why, if they were just processing food dye, like everyone here seemed to think, including me, no delivery trucks ever took anything out of there, only dropped things off. I didn't know the answer to any of this. No one ever went down Sargo Road or cared what happened there. Exactly, Beatty said with that weird grin of his that told you he was the smartest one in the room. If you wanted to keep something secret, he said, you came to a nothing hick burg like ours. You got a place on Sargo Road, and you built a fence. He claimed the location had actually been his idea. Before that, the people he worked for had started in Volgograd. Russia, he added, as if I didn't know. He slapped a mosquito away and shook his head sadly, pitying me. All I could see of his face was the glint of the moonlight off his glasses. Poor Mark, he said. If I told you what we've been up to in there, you wouldn't get to sleep for a long time. He'd walked out of there 2 hours ago without locking anything up. He hadn't even been back to his house. Do you realize what they'd do to me? He said. If they knew I hadn't sealed the place. It was torture, every word out of his mouth, his games. Nothing had changed with him. This was why no one had ever wanted to be his friend. This was why the girls I liked used to like him instead, because he always seemed to have the edge on you, always had dominion over your mind. But when he told me he was scared, I believed him. I'd never heard him admit he was anything less than perfect. He was so scared tonight, he said. He'd felt the need to see my elderly grandmother after all these years, just for a little comfort. I insisted again I hadn't talked to her that week. I asked him what he was scared of. What did that mean? He did something that made me afraid then, which is walk right past me without a word and go back into the house. I followed him. He just kept going, all the way through the living room, sensing his way through the dark, then through the front door and out toward his Mercedes. That was where he finally stopped and turned back to me. He told me to lock my door and not talk to strangers, not tonight. Then he got in his car and drove away. The smartest guy in town. By midnight, I was so tense listening to every sound inside this house that I couldn't stay here. I walked to the edge of the drive and stared down Halt Horse Road into the dark. On foot, I went west, where the blacktop curved into the woods and stayed there for 2 miles. I wasn't worried about a car coming the other way and clipping me. There was no chance of anyone being out. To keep my mind flat as I could make it, I mentally recited the rules to ride the Devil's Wheel at Kennywood Park. I even mouthed the words. It was a trick I had to use sometimes to not remember what happened to me on that ride back in the day. That was the one where you went into a dark room with a strobe light going and stood against a wall, and the whole room began to spin so fast, and at some point the floor fell away and all our bodies still clung to the wall. Centrifugal force. I had turned my head to my grandma as we were whipped around and around. I saw her in bright, alternating flashes of sticky, seeping neon blue and blinding white. Her eyes were wide, and she was laughing at me, at how afraid I was. To me, it was the end of the world. The trees went by on Halt Horse Road. The steps accumulated beneath my old sneakers. I took a left on Sheep's Head Lane, where I hadn't walked in years. The old farmhouse where they'd arrested some guy for hoarding weapons was still for sale. Millicent Pond was almost dry, filled with green murk. The sign at the intersection of Sheep's Head and Sargo Road had been tilted toward the woods for as long as I could remember. I think someone had once rammed into it on a Vespa. The road sloped down, curved to the right, and then opened up a little. And then, just past the corner where the old body shop used to be, I was looking at the old McGradnick and Brothers building, sitting all by itself, flanked by a couple of wooden light posts, only one of which was working. You could still see the ghost of the McGradnick name in elaborate cursive if you squinted hard enough at the cracked cement. No cars were in the lot, which was just pale gravel, room enough for maybe 4 of them. It was funny how I never even thought about the fence until Beatty mentioned it. But yeah, there it was. Now the makeshift gate that had been cut out of it was halfway open, like it was inviting me to come in and see. A special pass in the middle of the night. I trespassed once when I was a boy, and never again. Trespassing was on the list of things that would make Grandma go to the shed and get the tripod. I'd gotten close enough. I turned around, and I saw someone. There was a man standing at the far edge of the property, near an old well, looking up at the moon, just like Beatty had done. He was wearing a long coat and a scarf, even though it was over 70 degrees. I tried to walk away before he could sense me, but before I could even get a step back down Sargo Road, he had turned. I kept my head down and started walking. In a minute, I was beyond the faint glow of the last streetlight and headed back toward where the trees would swallow me up. Not until I got to the intersection of Sargo and Sheep's Head did I turn around. He was following me, that man, walking slowly along the faded double yellow line, not clinging to the shoulder like I was. I got just a glimpse of his shape and then quickened my pace. I felt a little safer turning back onto Halt Horse past Millicent Pond. In the trees, I heard rustlings like things were moving about, tracking me. At the top of the hill, I turned my head and looked back again. Here he came, that man. A tiny, massive darkness swallowed up in the night 100 yards behind me. Even though I was walking fast and he was walking slow, he was somehow keeping up with me. I started to jog, but there was no way I had the endurance to keep it up. Just a few minutes away, though, from my house, now. The road bent to the right. I saw a faint flash of heat lightning in the sky, but I heard no thunder. At the top of the last rise on Halt Horse Road, I made myself stop completely and look back one more time. He was there, standing directly under a lamppost, not moving, just watching me go. For the first time in years, I broke into a run. The clock on my living room wall said it was almost 1:30 when I got back inside. I was sweating. I was wiped out. I stood with my back against the door for a long time, which made it feel like I was banishing whatever might be out there somehow. I tensed up when I heard a police siren far away, but it never seemed to get any closer, and finally it faded to nothing. I shook a match from the box on the coffee table into my hand, lit a candle, and went into the kitchen, then beyond it. Deer had congregated in the backyard. 6 of them. Even when I came out the back door and stepped into the tall grass, they didn't move, as if they had no fear of me at all, staring at me with pinprick eyes. I yelled at them to scram and waved my arms, and most of them did. But 2 stayed behind. They were staring each other down. I'd never seen that before. Then they charged at each other, right there, in the backyard. I closed my eyes just before their heads collided, and I heard a thin, cracking sound. Still holding the candle, I turned and yanked on the back door and hurried inside, feeling sick. I needed a cool place to sit and calm myself. I opened the cellar door and descended the wooden stairs. God, it was dark. The old place from childhood of banishment, punishment, isolation, days at a time. Odors of mold and dampness. I had just barely set my foot on the bottom step when I saw the candlelight catch someone sitting in a rocking chair in the middle of the cracked cement floor. It was the man from Sargo Road. The black coat and scarf he wore only made sense here, in the subterranean coolness of the basement. Before I could turn to run, he assured me in a soothing voice that there was nothing to fear here, no harm. He only wanted to sit and rest for a while. He repeated his request a second and third time among my insistence that he had no right to be here and that I was about to call the police to report an intruder. I was almost at the top of the staircase again when in that cultured and convincing voice, he made mention of the building on Sargo Road, and what he wanted to describe to me about what he'd seen in there. That was what kept me with him, turning and descending again slowly, though I stayed near the staircase, holding the candle just high enough to throw a sad yellow glow on the bottom of his bearded face from 20 feet away. Yes, he had been inside. Yes, he had seen things. But they had confused him. For while he saw many things which made him think it was a laboratory, how could the unsanitary conditions be excused? He didn't know how he had gotten there. The last thing my visitor remembered was being on a skiing holiday in a country far away, putting his skis into his car, and at some point everything had gone black as the repository of his memories seemed to collapse in on itself, its contents swirling down into a yawning pit without light or sound. When he awoke, he was standing in the corner of a room inside that building on Sargo Road. He was looking at a man lying on a table. But that man was himself. He was looking at his own body. He had been cut very thoroughly and very precisely in two, his upper part and his bottom part, pushed together like the two halves of a sandwich. His hands had been immersed in two shallow bowls. Elaborate designs had been scrawled all over his naked flesh in blue ink. This was what he saw. It felt like the man was hypnotizing me somehow from a predetermined script as he rocked gently back and forth in the chair. For days, he said, he had stood there in the corner of the windowless room, watching scientists come and go in the hours before dawn, until it occurred to him that the weak corporeal structure he sensed was wrapped around his thoughts could be made to move. And so he did move, out of the room and out into the night. But not past the fence, no, because he was frightened to go too far away. And weren't those nameless people in the room shocked and dismayed when he was suddenly gone? For they had seen him all along standing in that corner, and they'd just been waiting to see what he might do next. They could not find him, though they looked everywhere. He'd enjoyed the game of hide and seek, enjoyed their fear. But finally, the very last man in the building had run away, and the place became as lonely as any on earth. The creaks of the rocking chair stopped. The man's hands were clenched into fists. He had died on his skiing trip, he believed. He wasn't afraid anymore. He'd followed me because he had sensed a presence in this house, a faint trail of being, one that was like him, the way he was now. A woman, he said. An old woman who was angry. He thought it might be better now to go back to Sargo Road and wait in the dark for someone to return. In the next moment, my candlelight fell only on an empty chair. It started just a few minutes ago, the sound of someone singing upstairs, wafting through the pipes and the cracks in the floorboards. An old folk ballad she once used as a lullaby with my father. No matter how long I stand here in the dark, I know I have to go upstairs and face her and account for what I have done. It only means she's won again, as she always will. A laughing incarcerator, slamming door after door in the chambers of my ruined heart.
Oh, where, tell me where has your iron laddie gone? He's gone with streaming banners, where noble deeds are done, and it's over in my heart.